This is Joanna Kearns, and you're listening to Fascination Street podcast.
Yeah, AV in your ears. That's Ambush being giving you this audio visual down the most interesting street in the world with my voice, Steve. Fascination Street. You already know. Let's get it. When you whip in the Fascination Street, what do you?
Welcome back, Streetwalkers. This episode is with Carolyn Jones. Carolyn Jones is an author. Carolyn Jones is a photographer. Carolyn Jones is a documentary filmmaker, director, executive producer, and, like I say as soon as the episode starts, most importantly, Carolyn Jones is a storyteller. In this episode, we get to find out what made Carolyn Jones decide to become a photographer and then a filmmaker. She shares a few stories that don't relate to that field at all because I asked her some bizarre questions. I mean, she was a race car driver for a hot minute. But mostly, this episode, we talk about her filmmaking. She has made several films and is currently in the midst of another film. These are documentaries that focus on how we live as humans, how we interact with each other. A lot of it is told through the prism or the lens of nursing and how nurses affect us, but not all of them. We also talk about how people live and die in this country and in the world. And she is open and honest about all of that. We talk a lot about nurses, what we think makes nurses tick and what makes them so special. We talk about her book and her film, The American Nurse. We talk a lot about her film, Defining Hope. Her recent film, In Case of Emergency, which kind of got paused right in the middle of the COVID thing because, hello, there was stories coming in. That was a whole thing that had to be included, right? And then we talk about her new film that is almost done and will be out soon called Catalysts. Carolyn was a blast to talk to. Follow her on all the socials. Go check out her website, carolynjones.com. And this is my conversation with documentary filmmaker and storyteller, Carolyn Jones.
Prepare to be fascinated. Prepare to be fascinated. Prepare to be fascinated.
Welcome to Fascination Street podcast, Carolyn Jones. How are you doing today?
Excellent. How are you doing?
I am fan-freaking-tastic. Ask me why.
Why, Steve?
Because I get to talk to you. Oh my gosh. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Carolyn Jones. Now, I know you're going to be confused like I was when I was trying to do some research. This is not the woman who played Morticia Addams on The Addams Family. This Carolyn Jones is an author, a photographer. Can I say author? I can say author, right?
You can, yeah.
Okay. Is an author, a photographer, a documentarian, an executive producer, a director, all of the things. But most importantly, she is a storyteller. Carolyn, what I like to do is I like to start from the beginning. It helps us understand how the guests got to where they are from where they were. So where were you born and raised? Where'd you grow up?
I was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the middle of Amish country.
I recognize the beard.
Thanks for that. The thing that makes it interesting is that I've been a photographer ever since I was a kid, and I was surrounded 360 degrees by people who didn't want to have their photograph taken because they believed that when you took their image, you were taking their soul. And I think it has a lot to do with why I'm who I am.
Do you think that growing up in Amish country, Lancaster, has a lot to do with who you are?
I do. I think sort of being surrounded by something so picturesque and so beautiful and so different that to not be able to capture it, to not be able to connect, gave me this kind of thirst for understanding the way other people live. And it's kind of like when you're a parent, you want to teach your kid how to swim and you say, don't go in the ocean or don't go in the pool. And, you know, the idea is that they're going to do that anyway. And it makes you kind of want to overcome something. And that's what it was for me. You tell a kid that they can't take photographs of something and all you want to do is take photographs of it.
I don't even think that applies to kids. I think if you put an adult into a room and say, don't touch that button, as soon as the door closes, they're going to touch that button.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I'm a product of that, I think.
So you're growing up in Lancaster. I know that it was an early age, like 12 or 13, that you decided against playing the violin and traded it in for a camera. But besides how weird that is, what did you want to be? Did you have any ideas of what you wanted your future to be other than not living in Amish country anymore?
Not really. I mean, I was just a sort of a strange kid in that I just didn't really fit in where I was growing up. I always felt like I was kind of from another planet, and I didn't really understand the people around me very much. And I love my family, don't get me wrong, but I would look at them and just wonder if where they came from and why I was part of this family. It was very homogenous, with the exception of the Amish people. And my upbringing was fairly secluded in a way in Lancaster. And, when I thought about what I wanted to do, I was always really interested in taking things apart and putting them back together. So I think I had this sort of technical side to me that had me, taking apart the vacuum cleaners and the telephones and everything in the house just to see how it worked. So I had a how does this work kind of mentality. And also how do I fit into the world? And that's where the camera was just like this huge passport for me to be able to go anywhere and talk to anybody. And I didn't have to fit in. I could just listen to their story, and people love to tell their stories. So it gave me a really good passport.
I wholeheartedly concur. People do love telling a story, and that is why I started this show. I'm coming up on 6 years doing the show. And right around that time, my wife she is a nurse executive, but she was traveling around the country for a company, and she was opening psychiatric hospitals, like from the ground up. She was on site, making sure everything was doing everything it was supposed to do. And, that took her to states all across the US, and she would be gone for weeks at a time. And when I would go to wherever she was, go visit go hang out with her for a few weeks, wherever she was, invariably I'd be sitting next to somebody on a plane or an airport or in a restaurant. And, you're sitting on a plane next to somebody for a few hours, you're going to talk. And multiple times I would be talking to somebody, and they're just regular people. They're not famous. They're not musicians. They're just people. And I would be so fascinated by their story that at the end of the flight, I'd be mad that I didn't record it. And so eventually I was like, what the hell's wrong with me? I'll just record everything. So that's why I started the show. I do believe that everybody has a story. I am fascinated to share them with my listeners. And I don't know if I said it earlier, but thank you so much for coming to be on the show. You came across my radar because you were a guest speaker at an event for a company that my wife works for. This would have been 2-3 weeks ago, I think. And my wife was telling me all about the email that came out that you're going to be there, or maybe it hasn't happened yet. I think it's already happened. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this lady sounds amazing. And so I reached out, and then here we are. So long, convoluted way of saying, I can't believe you took the time to reach back out to me. And this happened pretty fast after that. So thank you again.
Well, you have to understand that I ask this of people all the time. So there is a certain amount of karma involved here, that as soon as you said that you had so many people that you love in your life who are nurses too, I wouldn't have not responded. So thank you for inviting me.
You are welcome. You would be surprised at the people who do this for a living that don't reciprocate, don't even reply. So, but hey, that's cool. People be people. Carolyn, where did you get this fascination with what makes life worth living?
Oh, so probably two places. In the early 90s, I did a book called Living Proof: Courage in the Face of AIDS. I was living in New York City. I'd been in the fashion industry for a few years. I had a lot of friends who were affected by HIV and AIDS. And the media was full of so many negative stories and so much that was really hard to look at. It was just a tough time. And I was watching people that I really care about kind of deal with the path that they had to take to get through a time when there was so much social stigma and medication wasn't available. This was long before there was a drug cocktail that made it somewhat manageable to live with HIV. So I had friends who were dying, and one of my dearest friends told me that he had AIDS and wanted to do something about it. So we decided to do a collection of photographs that would show people living with AIDS rather than people dying from AIDS. Meet people that, even though they knew how their life was going to end, that they had embraced every moment that they had and they were going to live it to the fullest. So I threw open the doors of my studio and I invited in hairdressers and makeup artists and caterers that I had worked with for the last few years. And we would have these big living proof shoot days where I would photograph people with someone or something that they love. And it was eye-opening because it was, first of all, probably one of the biggest privileges of my life was to spend time with people who had embraced and grabbed their life just like that. And they taught me what makes life worth living. They took my conversation from a place where, in the fashion industry, it was just kind of on a completely different level. But all of a sudden, I'm talking to people about what really matters in life. So that really planted a seed for me. And years later, when I started working on projects that were using the lens of nurses to look at issues in our country, I talked to a lot of nurses about the fact that we don't die very well in this country. It's a longer conversation, has a lot to do with the development of technology and how much agency we have and kind of not knowing what choices we have at the end of life. So I decided to do a film that was originally going to be called Dying in America, which my distributor was like, I don't think anybody's going to go see that film. And I realized as soon as I started working on that project that I wasn't photographing people who were dying. That wasn't the idea. I was following 8 patients who had life-threatening illnesses and following them as they made choices about how they wanted to live the rest of their life. And so it brought me right back to the Living Proof project of thinking about what makes life worth living. And if we could just focus on that now when we're all here and vibrant and alive and not wait until the last moment, that it could perhaps enrich all of our lives.
The film that you were talking about that was going to be called Dying in America, is that Defining Hope?
It is.
And so that one is specifically about not necessarily hospice, but people who have a terminal illness of some sort and how they choose to spend their days and the decisions they make. Is that right?
That's pretty much it. I mean, it's kind of a glimpse into the lives of people. There's a young woman who had a brain tumor. It's like, what kind of choices do you make when you know that medical procedure that you could have might prolong your life, but is it really just prolonging the dying process? Those kind of nuances. I wanted to show people that we have control over this. We don't have to just do everything that's laid out for us. We can make choices. Like there's an elderly couple that I love so much, the Cohens. And when I met them, Bert Cohen was like 92 years old and all he wanted in the whole wide world was to die at home. He just didn't want to go back to the hospital for anything. And his wife, all she wanted was for him to go back to the hospital no matter what happened. She just wanted to hang on to him. They'd been together since they were teenagers. And I got to witness them coming together on that with the nurse who guided them so that she could embrace what his desire was and he could get what he wanted at the end of life. And that was one of the most beautiful things I was able to witness, to be able to know that we have choices and we can follow a path that we choose. It may not go the way we want it to, but we can have some agency over this. That's
beautiful. We are going to jump all over the place because your career has so many different facets that I'm blown away by. Before we go too much further, I have to ask you to give me one story about the time you were a co-driver in the Paris to Dakar Rally. What?
Okay. Just for a little bit of context, the Paris Dakar Rally, it's an unbelievably exciting event that used to leave from the Place de Concorde in Paris on New Year's Day. One year, many years ago, when I was working for a fashion photographer, I happened to be in Paris on that day on a fashion shoot. And in the middle of the night, I went to the fountain there and watched all of these people from all walks of life, like really famous race car drivers and people just like me, not too many people just like me, but a few, celebrating, opening up bottles of champagne, getting ready to do this kind of life journey that was going to take them across the Sahara Desert. I never saw so much vibrancy and life and kind of a quest for figuring out what makes your heart beat faster than that night. And it got under my skin. And I really, really wanted to do this rally because it's not just about race car driving. It's about survival. It's about what kind of training you do. Are you able to survive the desert? Can you fix your car if it breaks down? There's so much that goes into the training of that rally. And I think it shows you who you are. It touches on every aspect of your personality. And you find out whether you like yourself or not. And I had a hunch that's where it was going to go. So for years, I wanted to do it. And I actually had a sign in my office that said, if you know anybody who wants to do the Paris Dakar Rally, tell me. And one day some model walks in, this wonderful woman that I used to photograph all the time. And she said, oh, I know somebody who wants to do it. And so she introduced me to a gentleman named Ed McCabe. And one thing led to another. And we took 2 years off and did that rally, trained for it, moved to Paris, studied. The road book is all in French. So tried to, had to learn how to navigate in French and train for it, only to get out there. And on day 8, after having gotten through the worst part of the rally, which is Algeria, which is literally like driving through hell, we ran out of fuel. And we spent 3 days sitting in a part of the desert where there wasn't any air rescue. And I wasn't sure we were going to get out of there. We ran out of food and water. It was a moment for me to discover for myself what makes life worth living and what was going to be important to me if I got out of there. This will really do a number on a relationship, just for the record, if anybody's ever thinking about it. Because again, you really figure out who you are and how you're put together. And it was really, truly one of the most difficult and challenging and rewarding times of my life that I will never, ever forget. We were rescued. I thought at that point, Ed was going to trade me for a tank of gas and probably would have happily left me with the gentleman from the desert that came out of nowhere. But he didn't, thank God. And we got out of there.
Wow. I'm assuming there's pictures of that somewhere since you had 5 cameras on the car.
There are. Nikon was nice enough to give me these titanium cameras that I had mounted to the car with the idea that I was going to film where we were going and where we had been and what was going on inside the car.
The fights.
Yeah, there's some unfortunate moments there, but like within the first day, the front camera was taken out, so one by one, I kind of lost some of them, but there are images. And look, it was an extraordinary life experience that changed the way I look at the world. And I wouldn't trade in a day of it for anything.
I love it. Filmmakers generally begin a project because they have a story to tell, share, or discover. What stories were you looking to discover or share when you decided to become a filmmaker? Because I know that you were a photographer, like a still photographer, for a really long time before you decided to get behind a moving camera. So what stories were you looking for?
I kind of have to go back to explain portrait photography for me. There are lots of different ways that photographers approach portrait photography. Some kind of approach it that a subject could walk into the studio and you interpret who they are and you already have that in your head. And so you put them in a situation and you light them and you take the image and you fulfill your perception of what you want that image to look like and who you think that person is. And then there are the other kinds of, Irving Penn comes to mind as like a great example of what I aspire to, which is the subject comes into the studio and you're like an open book. Like what gestures does this person have that I don't know about? What matters to them? Who are they? How do they present themselves? What kind of coat did they wear? Are they still wearing their hat? Whatever it is that you can sort of get into and take a portrait that emerges from them rather than your interpretation. I always wanted to be that kind of photographer. And I always, especially when I was working on Living Proof, which was the first kind of portrait book that I published, I sat with my subjects a long time to figure out what we were going to include in the photograph. So I wanted to really dig into their hearts and figure all that out. So if you look at the progression of the books that I've published, the first one's Living Proof. So there's a really big picture and there's a little tiny caption. It's like there's a quote from each person. And then the next book I did was a book called The Family of Women, which was women from 3 different generations within the same family. And so it was a collection of interviews. And in that book, the pictures aren't quite as big and the copy's bigger. And so there are a lot more words. And then as I progressed, by the time I shot the book, The American Nurse, it's equal. There's equal copy to the photograph. So the words over the course of a decade were getting more and more important to me. The stories, I just felt bad that everybody wasn't hearing what I was hearing. So I started recording the interviews, just like you. It's the same thing, and wanting to share those stories, but wanting to see them as well. And then one thing just evolved into the next. So as soon as I'm talking about a story, now all of a sudden I want to illustrate it. So my progression into filmmaking was kind of a slow, steady thing from still photography to being able to illustrate the stories that people were telling me.
Hey, Streetwalkers, here's a word from our sponsors. Let's get back into it.
Thank you for explaining why you decided to turn into a filmmaker. But now I have to ask why you decided, because your last 1, 2, 3 films, and I'm assuming the current one that you're working on, they are documentaries that are told through the lens of nursing. And I gotta know, well, first of all, do you have an addictive personality? Because 4 films about the same thing says you do.
No, they're not films about nurses, but we can get into that. But I probably do have an addictive personality.
So what is the fascination with the lens through which you're telling these stories?
So I guess I look at it this way. My whole career, I've been looking for authenticity and who people really are and finding the people that have kind of the least veneer. You know this from interviewing, I'm sure. You know, sometimes you talk to someone and you kind of feel like you have to chip away at a brick wall to kind of get to where you want to get, right?
Absolutely.
And then you meet other people and it's right there. You know, you can just feel it, that they're just completely present and completely authentic and just telling you like it is. And I love those moments. I just happen to love living in that place where I can talk to people on that level. So I have a nonprofit that I was running with a woman that I work with now as my producer. And we were on a completely different track than the nurse track when I was asked to do a book about nurses. The only thing I knew about nurses was that I had had breast cancer. I'd had an incredible nurse. Out of all the people that got me through the experience, it was this one nurse who was just irreverent and funny. And I loved her. And I had never really acknowledged what she did for me, you know, because you don't, right? You don't really just kind of pick up the phone and say, hey, let's go kick around old times, because you don't want to go down that path again. So,
hey, remember when thought I was going to die and you saved my life? Hey, let's talk some more about that.
Yeah, I know. It's a bummer, right? You just don't want to really, you kind of close that chapter and move on. So when I was asked to do a book about nurses, I was like, oh, well, that's interesting, because that's kind of a whole DNA that I don't really understand. And I'm really curious how she had this kind of emotional intelligence that I found so effective. So I said, sure, I'll do this book and I'll dig in on that. So I started traveling across the country and I met over 100 nurses and took their portraits and captured their interviews on video. I have never, except for when I was working on Living Proof, Courage in the Face of AIDS, I had never before sat down with people one after another who were completely authentic, transparent, and real, like the way these nurses were. I was meeting nurses from all walks of life. Now, I will say that this wasn't just a general sampling of nurses. These were nurses that were recommended by the hospitals that they worked for or their colleagues or organizations that I had contacted. I wasn't just looking for random nurses. I was really interested in certain things going on in the country: poverty, our prison system, returning war veterans, birth, death, so many things I wanted to explore through the lens of nursing. I wanted to know how it affected the human body. And nurses are the best way to get there. Like, how does the opioid crisis really affect us and our families and our communities and our society? Well, that's a tough topic, but if you use nurses as your inroad to get there, you can get closer to what the truth is, because they're so authentic and they're non-political. And this isn't all nurses. I mean, I wouldn't say this about everybody, but for the most part, the nurses that have touched my life are non-judgmental and non-political. And that's why it's a kind of straight road into understanding an issue, understanding how it affects human beings and all the people around them. So the book made me want to dig in on those 5 topics I just mentioned: the prison system, returning war veterans, poverty, birth, and death. So I looked at those 5 topics and said, who can help me get into those worlds? And then that project just led me to wanting to talk about the end of life. And how am I, Carolyn Jones, going to find people who are navigating the waters of terminal disease without some assistance from somewhere? And so nurses were the way in for me to find those patients and tell the stories that I wanted to tell. And one thing kind of led to another. Once I did that, I'm very affected by the news and the world around us. And I was really hung up on gun violence and the opioid crisis. And this was before COVID hit. And I got a phone call one day from a gentleman from the Emergency Nurses Association. And I wasn't going to do another project that had nurses involved. I was finished with this. I was going to move on. But he said, everything that's going on in the country is reflected in the emergency department.
So the project that you had done and finished, and you thought that you had closed that chapter, that project was?
Defining Hope.
Okay. So then you get this call from the gentleman.
Right.
I'm sorry. Now go ahead. Sorry about that. I just wanted to know where we are in your filmography here.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I'm sorry for rambling. But when I finished the American Nurse book, I thought I was finished with nurses. But it was like this little nagging thing, like I can go deeper. I can find something out. And then when I did the American Nurse film, I was just left with this nagging feeling of that we're not dying very well. And if people could understand that process, maybe it would help us make better choices. And so that was why the film Defining Hope was born. And then when I finished Defining Hope, one of the things that really bothered me was that as we get to the end of life and we make choices, we often think we want them to do everything at all cost, or we write, do not resuscitate as our desires. But people don't really understand what all that looks like. What it looks like to give CPR to an 80-year-old woman in the emergency department. Some of the things that we're able to do that are shielded from us because we're not always able to be with our loved ones at that moment in time are really beyond what we might want if we saw them. And I kept thinking, if I filmed in emergency rooms and I could capture some of the things that we're capable of doing, maybe people could make better choices about that. But, it's extremely complex to film in hospitals and emergency departments, and there's HIPAA and there's legal issues and there's a lot. So I love the stories that we were able to capture making that film. And we were able to explore gun violence and the opioid crisis and ultimately the COVID pandemic. But I still feel like I didn't quite get to it. So I guess that's a long way of saying that it isn't an obsession about nurses. Nurses are the vehicle. Nurses are a unique lens. And in this world that we live in of specialization, especially with technology, there are so few generalists. And I don't think it's fair to say that all nurses are generalists, because they're not, but there are so few people that are able to look at not just your elbow or your heart or your liver, but who's this human being? Who in their life can care for them? How do they all affect one another? And what part do they play in the community? And what role does the community have in their health? And all of those things, I think, lead us to a better society. So I'm very focused on that.
The film that you were making that talked about or showed, gun violence and opioid addiction and things. Was that in case of emergency?
Yes.
Okay, so am I correct that that film was almost done and then COVID happened and you had to basically open it back up and add all of that? Am I correct in that?
That's exactly right. We had a premiere scheduled for either March or April of 2020. We were ready. It was scored. It was ready to go. And then I was living in Tribeca in Manhattan, and I was sitting in my office looking at what was going on in the world and just thought, we can't release this film without waiting to see what's going to happen, because it was all happening in the emergency rooms. So we kind of stopped dead in our tracks there and decided to go back to one of the hospitals that we'd filmed in to try to capture part of the COVID experience and how it was affecting the people who were working there. Again, it was a real privilege to get to do that. And so that became part of the film as well, to tell that story.
You basically, for lack of a better term, had the film locked. And then this worldwide pandemic, catastrophic, literal emergency happens, taking place over emergency rooms all over the planet. Not to be gross, but money comes from somewhere to make a movie, whether it's a documentary or not. So how hard was it to go to the people with the money and say, look, I know that we said we were done. We're going to have to shelve this for what turned out to be kind of a long time.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't want money or names, but what was the process of having to say, hey, guys, we're not quite done yet. Is that okay? Like, can we have some more money and time?
So it's a really good question. Filmmaking and raising funds for documentary films is a challenging part of it, for sure. I have always been unbelievably lucky to have great support with these projects that I've worked on and been able to go back to, there's always something, honestly, that you didn't expect, or a story that you just want to get a little bit more that wasn't in your budget, or, there's always something. I remember with Defining Hope, our film was 78 minutes and we got it on PBS, but we needed to cut a 60-minute version. So I had to go back to the funders and raise funding to re-edit the film. In case of emergency, that film was fully funded by the Emergency Nurses Association. And in a way, they were the ones that were the most sympathetic about how important it was that we try to grab this story and tell as much of it as we possibly could. It was their story in so many ways. And they happened to be just an unbelievable organization with really gracious people who just wanted to tell the truth. And that's all any of us wanted to do. So, it wasn't hard. It was a conversation and everybody got it, and everybody got how important it was. So they supported it.
Fantastic. How much did the film change? Obviously, COVID was a huge part of the story, but how different was the film that you locked versus the film that you relocked?
It has a new beginning and a new ending. I think that there were things in the film that were more lighthearted that came out. I think that the whole film got a little bit more serious than it was initially. Not that there's very much that's funny in the emergency departments across America.
Patch Adams is not rolling around all the emergency departments?
No, I couldn't find him anywhere. I was looking, though. Like, if anybody put a red ball on their nose, I'm in, but couldn't find that. So I think it became more thoughtful. When you add something, you have to take something out, right? So there were a couple of stories that maybe we didn't go as deep or just got edited completely.
I always hate to ask this question, but for some reason I keep asking it. I'm sure that there's reams or reels and reels of footage, or I guess we say hard drives now. Is there a possibility of maybe in case of emergency 2 or whatever, to sort of get some of those stories that, didn't quite make it?
So to answer that question, no. But I am devoted to not having reams and reams of footage that are never used. And so all of the interviews that we do, we edit and title, and we offer them in their educational material for nurses and high school students and graduate students all over the country. From each one of our films, we always do this. If there's any kind of ethical, like Defining Hope's a great example. Some of the stories stories, we turned into kind of ethical questions. What would you do here? Or how can you open this line of thinking there? In case of emergency, it's mostly with the interview process. None of that gets wasted. And I don't like having that not go anywhere. So I like telling stories on a lot of different levels, and I like it when it's educational. So, you can kind of make all of this educational.
I love that there is no cutting room floor for you.
Well,
for Carolyn Jones Productions. No, you can't change it now. I'm going to stick with that.
I didn't say there's no cutting room floor.
No, I said it.
It is always a mission of ours. Part of it is like, I've asked people to stop and talk to me. I've asked people to open up, and I'm digging in. I'm asking for, deep conversations about things that matter to them. And I'm showing them working in really difficult situations. So it doesn't seem right to not honor them with, having that be a part of the website and the educational materials. So yeah, that is really important to me.
I mean, you are asking these people to bare their soul. Obviously, their time is important, but you're asking them to bare their soul, to show their wounds, to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of a woman who she helps parents whose children didn't make it. I can't remember her name off the top of my head.
Oh, Naomi Cross. Oh, wow. Perinatal bereavement. That's what you're talking about. Yeah.
I think it's beautiful that you're asking these people to spend this time and to be vulnerable and to be a raw nerve, and none of it gets wasted. That's my favorite part of the whole story, is that none of it gets wasted. Thank you for that. That is really sweet.
I appreciate that. That is definitely a goal.
I think 2.5 years ago, you said, and I quote, "We always remember the names of our doctors, but we don't remember the names of our nurses." Do you think that's still true? I mean, it's only been 2 years or whatever, but
I do.
Why do you think that is?
Part of it is the nurse. A nurse is so focused on the patient when a nurse walks into the room. I watch nurses leave themselves kind of at the door as they enter a room with a patient and their family. To understand what that patient is going through, I think they have to be this is what makes them so authentic, right? They have to be so present. They have to be completely reading everything about that person, the color of their skin. I mean, like whether they're healthy, whether their cheeks are flushed, all the other senses that come about when you meet someone. They're not focused on one thing. They're focused on this whole human being. And to be able to do that, you have to kind of leave your stuff at the door and walk through that room, because they're caring for us no matter what political party we belong to, no matter what, and this is true of all people in the medical profession, but whatever religion we practice, or in what I've seen over and over is whatever crime we may have committed. And to be able to put feelings and thoughts aside and walk through the door and deal with someone with compassion on a really intimate level, it requires a certain amount of giving up of yourself. And I think nurses have this ability to empathize that makes them almost incapable of tooting their own horn or walking in the door and fully identifying who they are and what they do. Now, I think there's a lot of work being done about this. Nurse leaders across the country are trying to encourage nurses to do this. It would be good if they did. I'm Carolyn Jones and I'm here and this is what I'm going to do for you today. But very often a nurse comes in and is already empathizing by the time they've reached the bed. And so I think it puts the patient in a different head frame. The doctor comes in and the name tag is there and it's a whole different relationship. The skills that a doctor has compared to some of the what they call soft skills of a nurse, they're just different and we value them differently. And part of my work and part of the reason why I am still talking about nurses is because we need to change that. One of the things we've lost in this country is the ability to empathize, to be able to understand one another and to be able to look beyond our differences and to care for one another. Nurses are hardwired to do that every single day. And that's what they do first and foremost. So do they come in and tell us their full name so that we remember it and we know everything they're doing? No. They sit down in front of my camera and they say, oh gosh, there's probably somebody that you could have spoken to that might know more than I know. And I'm always like, no, I want to talk to you. You've been recommended to me and you're who I want to talk to. So it's complicated because the very thing that makes them so wonderful at what they do is the very thing that makes us not remember their names.
Beautiful and true. Something you just said, I'm going to change it a little bit. You don't have to, it's fine. But you said that one of the things we've lost in this country is the ability to show empathy. And I am going to say that we didn't lose the ability. We lost the desire. For some reason, we don't give a flying shit about anybody else anymore. And I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But on the nurses and doctors front, you said that we're sitting in an exam room and our experience with the doctor who comes in and the nurse who comes in is different. And I think that the most illustrative difference that I have seen in all of the times that I have been in those situations is that when a nurse walks in, she's looking at my eyes and talking to me. When a doctor walks in, he's looking at my chart and talking to a piece of paper. And that's how the interaction starts. So I think that it's wonderful that you are, I don't want to say immortalizing, but I'm going to. I think it's wonderful that you're immortalizing nursing as a profession and as people. I think I mentioned this to you earlier. My mother was a nurse. And she introduced me to my wife, who is a nurse. And my wife's mother is a nurse. My wife's sister is a nurse. My wife's brother is a nurse. And my wife's brother's wife is a nurse. There's a lot of nurses in my family. They all have the empathy, not just in their work life, but in their home life. And they care so much about even their patients. It's just insane, some of the stories that you get to hear on the home side of a professional nurse. Obviously, they don't use names or anything like that, but just some of the interactions. Most of all of those people that I just mentioned are psychiatric and or behavioral health nurses. And so their stories are a little bit different than some of the people who I mentioned who work in hospitals or at the VA. And so not as a storyteller, but as a story receiver, as a listener to these stories, they're super fascinating in all of the different walks of those lives and those styles. You have spent a lot of time around nurses. You have dug deep into their souls, into their lives, into what makes them tick. After all of that, if Jesus tapped you on the shoulder and said, Carolyn, what have you learned about what makes somebody want to become a nurse? What do you say?
There isn't one answer, I'm afraid. I've met nurses who feel like they were born nurses and nurses who became nurses. I think it either grabs you or it doesn't grab you. I thought you were going to say, if I was tapped on the shoulder and said, you get to do it all over again, what would you do? And I'd tell you one thing, I'd come back as a nurse in a heartbeat.
You would, even after all that you've seen and how hard it is, you would do it?
Yep, in a nanosecond.
Why?
Because it's so alive and because it makes a difference. And because at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to really give a damn how much money we make. It will matter how much purpose we had. It will matter if we touched people's lives. In preparation for making the film Defining Hope, I spent a year volunteering at Bellevue Hospital on the hospice wing. I wanted to understand the language of talking to people at the end of life and figure out what people were thinking about. And it was so informative for me. So much of what mattered boiled down to what you did and whose life you touched. And did you love and were you loved? I get to go to conferences all over the country. I don't know why nurses don't, since they don't toot their own horn. And you said I immortalize them. I don't. A lot of this is selfish because I think if we could pay attention to nurses, I think the country would be in a better place, which is a different conversation. But I go all across the country talking to nurses, and I look out sometimes over like thousands of nurses and think they have this thing the rest of us don't have. This knowledge that they have changed lives. And it's so beautiful. I don't think there's anything quite as beautiful as what they do. And that's why I'm still at it. And that's why I love to be around them. I keep thinking that through osmosis, I will become completely non-judgmental. It hasn't happened yet. So I probably have to do another film before I get there. But there are these traits that they have that I just think are just magnificent human traits that we should all strive for.
You said that these nurses, they have something that we don't have in that they were able to touch people in whatever way. And that is sort of a result of being a nurse. Do you think that they have something in them that we don't have that makes them want to do that?
Again, these are like huge blanket statements.
Of course.
I want to use that moment to also say I've met doctors who go in and look into people's eyes. So everything that we say, I'm not in a doctor versus nurses place. I think we need doctors desperately.
Oh, I get it. I love doctors. They're great. They save my life weekly.
So, I know nurses hate when we call them heroes, and they don't like that kind of savior thing. And so I don't want to go there, but I do think that some of us have more of a capability. There are those of us that will run into the fire and save the person, and there are those of us that are going to be nervous about going into the fire. And I'm not saying nurses are the only people who do this. Firefighters is a great example. There are people that have something in them that gives them the ability to be open enough to do this. So I know nurses have something that I don't have. I know when I get squeamish, and I've filmed enough nurses in enough situations. I have to hold the camera in front of my face just so I don't see what I wish I hadn't seen, and there's a nurse right in there, connecting to a human being in spite of it all. So yes, I think they have something I don't have. That's for sure.
So I know that right now you're working on another documentary. I believe it is a film about maternal mortality in the U.S. Is that catalysts or is that something else?
So to answer the question, the thing that I still feel I haven't accomplished with the work that I've done regarding nurses is recognizing the role they play in our society. And very often, I think they're in a unique position to make changes, particularly on the social determinants of health that affect the health of so many of us. I think they're in a unique position to know what would make things better. I really believe nurses can make the world a better place. And if we respected what they do and listened to them more, we could follow some of the programs that they're suggesting that do make the world a better place. So that makes them catalysts for me. And so we've started this new kind of way of looking at things, not to get too in the weeds about it, but we were prompted by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were designed to make things more equitable in the world. How can we make the world more equal? More people can have access to food and health and water, and so many other things that are part of the development goals. So we started to look at nurses as catalysts. But what happened there is one of the development goals is regarding maternal mortality. You would think in a country that spends as much as we do on our healthcare, that we would have a pretty good number regarding maternal mortality. And in fact, it's dismal. Women die in this country, we're the worst of all the wealthy nations in terms of our maternal and infant mortality rates. And that really jumped out at me when I looked at the development goals and started looking at these numbers. And so I wanted to dig in on that. And of course, then you look at Black women in America that are dying 3 times more during childbirth than white women. And that gets really complicated really fast. And it deserves our attention. And so I wanted to tell the story of maternal mortality. I expected to be digging into a film that was going to be really hard to do and really dark. I have filmed 4 births in the last 6 weeks, and I have never seen so much hope, optimism, life, joy in these young families who are having these babies. The facts will be in this film. They're dark. The facts are dark. But in spite of it, we are still bringing babies into the world. And it is still as magnificently magical as it always was. And our country needs to learn how to preserve those moms and those children and help them so that they can become healthy members of our society. And I believe that a lot of those programs that nurses do will help us get there. Everything from prenatal care to breastfeeding, to postpartum, and the psychological aspects of having a baby as well. So all of that goes into what is the 1,000 days from pregnancy to the second birthday that so many nurse-run programs are a part of that make maternal health better.
I know this is also a foolish question. Is there any timeline about when that might see the light of day?
It's not a foolish question because I think people see that there's a lot about maternal mortality in the news right now. I think there's a lot more awareness than there was before, and that's a good thing. So I think this is a very timely topic. I think that this country is about ready to go deep into the quagmire of an ugly election cycle that is going to consume every corner of the media and our brains. And in a perfect world, I'd like for this film to come out before that so that we can be reminded of our humanity. And that's what this project is doing for me, is reminding me what we're capable of as women and families and doctors and nurses, and that there is a next generation that's coming into this world. And you watch a birth and it will just change everything. It just changes how you look at the world. But I always feel this way. I can't imagine I could put this film out there and show people what I've seen and people wouldn't find a way to respect one another a little bit more. It's worth it. I'm trying to show people what we're fighting for.
Wow. I can't possibly imagine any finer words to go out on. Carolyn Jones, tell everybody where they can find you on the social media and where can they go to see some of your previous projects?
Well, carolynjones.com is probably the home base for getting to the books and the films. The films are all on Amazon. I have a wonderful distributor called Kino Lorber, and they carry all the films, for educational uses and anything else. And I'm pathetic on social media, but we're determined to do better this year and with this project because it's worth it. So I guess the best place is carolynjones.com.
Fantastic. And lastly, before I let you go, is there anything that we didn't talk about or I didn't ask you about that you specifically wanted to talk about today? Did I miss any of that good stuff?
You're amazing. If I could just take 1 second to say, you have such a way of kind of leading from one thing to the next. And I think you gave me such a great chance to kind of take this moment to step back. And it's a good spot because of where I am with this current film and how I'm looking at life and how I'm looking at birth. And so it's a good place for me to kind of do this right now. And you did a great job of asking me questions that took me right there. So I thank you for that.
You're going to make me cry. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day and your hectic documentary filmmaking and storytelling schedule to hang out and let us get to know you a little bit better on Fascination Street. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's been a joy to talk to you, and you have a gift for interviewing. So thanks so much for giving me a chance.
Thank you so very much. And you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks. You too, Steve. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Opening music is the song FSP Theme, written, performed, and provided by Ambush Vin. Closing music is from the song Say My Name off the 2021 album Underdog Anthems, used with permission from Jax Hollow. If you like the show, tell a friend. Subscribe and rate and review the show on iTunes and wherever else you download podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. All the episodes are available there as well. Check me out on Vero at Fascination Street Pod and TikTok at Fascination Street Pod. And again, thanks for listening.